Observatory, and thank you all for joining today's event on contact. As you may well know, one of the observatory's key roles is to ensure that we try and close the gap between what we know from research evidence and what happens in practice. And this area of contact, and in particular what we know matters to children in terms of contact arrangements, is a sustained focus for the observatory. Over the last year, we have published several pieces of research, bringing together the research evidence that exists. And we've been working with colleagues around the country to try to test that research evidence in relation to practice. So I'm very pleased we've got three key academics to present to you today. We're going to hear from Professor Janet Boddy from the University of Sussex, from Dr. Padmini Iyer from the National Centre for Social Research. Janet and Padmini worked on two major research reviews for the observatory this year, pulling together the international evidence in relation to the impact of contact on the well-being of children. And we're also going to hear from Beth Neal from the University of East Anglia, who is well known for her work on contact in relation to adoption in particular. When the pandemic started and lockdown happened, Beth sprung into action and undertook some research to understand how contact arrangements were affected by the lockdown. So you're going to hear about all the studies that we've published this year. They're available on our website if you'd like to go and read them, together with a very short 8-minute read, a summary of the key messages that come out of those research findings. I guess when we started this work as an observatory, we couldn't have imagined the very changing circumstances that we were going to face this year, and in particular, the challenges for maintaining conscience for children post-placement. In particular, we've learned a lot about the need to maintain face-to-face contact for children, but also about some of the possible benefits of digital contact for some children. And we're going to hear about some of those findings this afternoon. So I'm just going to explain how this is going to work. We're going to have two 15-minute presentations, and then we will have the rest of the session ready for questions from yourselves. Please feel free to start making comments or putting questions on the chat function, and we will read those questions and call people forward to ask questions once we get to that stage of the event. We are recording today's session in the hope that we'll be able to share it with other colleagues, particularly from colleagues in CAFCAS, many of whom are attending today. So without further ado, I think I will hand straight over to Padmini, who's going to start. Padmini.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you all for coming today. We're really pleased to be presenting our findings from this research. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the evidence reviews that we did this year, and then I will pass over to Janet, who will present the key findings from those reviews. So to give you an idea of what we did, there are these two evidence reviews, both of which focus on the implications of contact for children and young people's well-being. So it's important to note that while there is a kind of vast body of literature on contact out there, we specifically focused on work looking at the relationship between contact and well-being. So one of our reviews on digital contact, that encompasses private and public law contexts, while the kind of main larger scale review focuses on children in care who are adopted or in special guardianship arrangements. And both evidence reviews were done in collaboration between the Centre for Children and Families at NatSen Social Research and the University of Sussex. So to give you an idea of the scope of the reviews, our main review was led by this research question. So what is known about the implications of contact for the well-being of children and young people who've been separated from their birth parents in public law contexts? This was a mixed methods review, and we synthesized findings from 49 studies. The digital contact review that we did was led by a very similar research question, except with a focus on digital contact and looking at public and private law contexts. So this review was commissioned by FJO, I think back in March, around the start of lockdown, and obviously questions around digital contact became very pertinent. This was a rapid evidence review, and we synthesized findings from 16 studies, so 11 in public law contexts and 5 in private law contexts. Across both of the reviews, we included international, academic and grey literature, which had been published between the year 2000 and 2020. And in both reviews, we adopted a kind of broad, multi-dimensional conceptualization of well-being. So this meant that our definition of well-being accounted for subjective feelings as well as individual and relational aspects. And it also encompassed kind of multiple factors related to well-being, as you can see here on the slide. So mental health, emotional well-being, physical health, through to all these different factors, and including children and young people's satisfaction with contact arrangements and the quality of their relationships with birth and placement families. So we just wanted to share some kind of key considerations informing our review before Janet presents the key findings. One of the things to note is that none of the studies we reviewed attempted to test a causal impact of contact on well-being. And in the end, that wasn't really so surprising, because there's not really a simple linear relationship between contact and well-being. The relationship is in fact shaped by multiple related factors, including variations in the forms and purposes of contact, diversity within the care population, and children's varied pathways through care systems. We also noted a need for a broad and dynamic definition of family when we were going through the evidence, and that's something that Janet will be highlighting as well. And we wanted to share this quote from one of the studies we reviewed from Wilson and Sinclair, because we think it reflects this kind of complexity quite nicely. So they noted that contact takes place within the context of variable and complex relationships. To isolate it from its context or see it as a simple variable with invariable effects is to misunderstand it. And then the last thing just to point out is this graph here, which we wanted to use really just to highlight the diversity of pathways that children have through and beyond care systems. So this provides a kind of overview of the different reasons that children ceased to be looked after in the year leading up to March last year. And I won't talk you through all of these, but as you can see, there are a lot of different reasons. So including a planned return home, moving into independent accommodation, special guardianship orders and adoption, and then all these kind of other reasons as well. And again, just to mention, that's important to bear in mind when we're thinking about the effects of contact on well-being, because there are so many different ways you can understand the quality of contact depending on the pathways that children and young people are following through care. And so now I'll hand over to Janet, who will talk you through the headline findings.
Yes, sorry, of course muted. It's the thing of the season. So can everyone hear me okay? I'll assume yes. I can't see anybody. Okay, so what I want to do is just pick up on on some of the key findings to come out of the work that we've done, and I'll focus in particular on our review of contact and well-being, the bigger review that Padmini talked about. But I'll also, as I go, I'll pick up key points relating to digital contact as I'm talking. And the overarching message from both of the studies was the need to focus on quality of contact. And we've talked in our report about a reimagining of contact as safe and meaningful involvement for the child. And I want to say a bit more about what that means as I go through, but broadly, you can think of it as having 3 components. So first of all, a child-centered approach, and that means a differentiated and dynamic approach, which takes account of children's rights, their needs and their perspectives, but also recognises that those might change over time as children grow older and as their circumstances change. And it also means recognising, as Padmini was indicating when she showed that graph, that the purpose of contact will be different for different people and will depend on what's important in their lives at different points. And that takes me to the second point, which is about a family-centred approach. Quality depends on a family-centred approach, which recognises the distinctively complicated nature of family for children who are in care, adopted, or in special guardianship. We need to think about what family means for the child, for the specific child, and also about how that might change over time. It means working to ensure that birth family involvement is not only safe, but enables positive experiences of connection with the key people in the child's life. And of course, this is challenging. So this takes me to the third pillar. Quality contact is well supported, enabled by skilled support and adequate resources. And that support has to be respectful to all parties, even if contact is challenging, as it so often is. Respect for the child, for their views and needs, and respect which recognises the importance of the key people in the child's life. So I want to go on and say a bit more about how those three key pillars relate to specific findings from our research. And the first is to understand what contact means for children's well-being, we need to listen to the views of children and young people. And we actually found a lack of research that had done this, but the studies that have been published give a very consistent message. Children and young people want their views to be taken into account. And when their views are not taken into account, that has negative implications for their well-being. Having said that, it's important to recognise that it's not straightforward for children and young people to express how they feel. And it's not always easy for adults to understand those views, to take those views into account. This is especially the case for the youngest children, but it's true more broadly just because of the complexity of the emotions and relationships involved. So in terms of practice implications, a careful balance is needed. It takes time and resource to understand and respond to young people's views, but it also needs care to ensure that children are not made to feel responsible for managing complicated and challenging relationships. Our next message is strongly emphasised in research that does include the views of children and young people, and that's the need for a broad and inclusive definition of family. This wider involvement with family networks is associated with a whole range of wellbeing indicators. And there are correspondingly clear implications for policy and practice, not least about the need to recognise the importance attached to contact with siblings, but also the value of maintaining links with extended networks, and that could include former carers as well, such as former foster carers. So it's crucial to look widely at the child's network and to facilitate their involvement when it's wanted by the child and it's safe. Digital contact can have particular value for that wider network, helping to maintain and establish links with people who might be living at a distance from the child. And the research also suggests that young people may particularly value digital contact because it's more immediate and less formal. The reviewed research also clearly shows the importance for child well-being of establishing the purpose of contact, recognising that this will vary according to who's involved, as well as shifting over time. And there's a related point here. While there can be a lot of debate about how much or how little contact is good or bad for children, we found no evidence of a relationship between frequency of contact and well-being factors, well-being outcomes. And that's because it's more complicated than that. It depends on the nature of the relationships and the purpose of the contact in the child's life. Quality is the key, not quantity, how much or how little. And unsurprisingly then, professionals play a key role in establishing what the purpose of contact should be. What kind of safe and meaningful involvement is appropriate, taking into account all of these key factors which shape questions of purpose, as summarised on the slide here. And that takes us to our next recommendation. One size does not fit all, and contact plans need to be tailored and regularly reviewed. It's crucial that everybody involved recognises the complexity of the relationship between contact and well-being. So, for example, contact can be both positive and negative. It can be highly valued by a child, but also worrying or upsetting. And a key message from both studies is that well-being depends on approaches to contact that fit with children's everyday lives, but which also take into account their lives over time. Thinking about their time in care, if they're in care, as well as thinking about those relationships going on into their adult lives. So if we take a digital example of that, it's really important that approaches to digital contact take account of children's age and their existing digital practices. What are the modes of digital communication that they're already familiar with, that they're likely to be comfortable with? And how can you adapt or build on that, whilst also recognising that, and perhaps especially for older young people, there are aspects of their digital lives which children might want to keep separate from family, that they might not want to use for contact, precisely because they're an important part of other aspects of their everyday lives. The second point relating to this is that we know that contact can be upsetting or stressful for children, but it's really important to understand that that doesn't necessarily mean it's not very important to them or that they want it to stop. So the research highlights a really crucial distinction, and I can't emphasize this strongly enough if we're thinking in terms of contact in children's best interests and their well-being, a distinction between contact that might upset a child but still be needed and wanted, and contact that has the potential to re-traumatize children or expose them to further risk of harm. It's really important that we don't confuse the two. And that relates to a second point, which is about birth family members' underlying needs and the implications of those needs for contact. Our review provides evidence that it's likely to be important for child well-being, for there to be support for birth parents following child removal. Supporting birth parents in relation to their underlying needs can reduce the stress for children and young people of contact when birth parents have complex underlying needs, as they so often do. So again, the implications for policy and practice are clear. Again, recognizing the dynamic nature of relationships, recognizing that contact plans shouldn't be static. They might change as a child gets older, as a birth parent situation alters. So contact plans need to be reviewed and updated regularly. And that allows that it might be necessary to pause contact arrangements, but also there should still be possibilities for review. For example, if support with a parent's situation means that risk to the child changes. And that leads me to our final recommendation about the importance of skilled professional support. Support matters because good contact is positively associated with child well-being in relation to all of these important indicators summarised here. But good contact is not straightforward to achieve. as well as support for professionals, we found evidence that there would be value in providing support and training for carers and for adoptive parents, as well as for birth parents and for children and young people themselves. Recognizing the challenges that all of these groups face in navigating complex relationships through contact, and helping them to build their understanding and resources to deal with the challenges that contact can involve. It can be particularly difficult for carers and professionals to set boundaries around digital contact. And that can also mean that children and young people end up with too much responsibility for managing digital relationships. So that's a really important area for training, especially at the moment. So in conclusion, quality matters. The key question is not how much contact is good or bad for children, but how we can give children and young people the best possible experiences over time. And that means thinking about how we can facilitate the safe and meaningful involvement of the people that matter to them in their lives. Digital modes can enhance face-to-face contact. They don't replace it. They can enhance it, they can supplement it, but they don't replace it. And we also need to take into account digital inequalities, and Beth, I know, will pick up on this later, in terms of access to technology and so on. But there are qualities of face-to-face contact that just can't be substituted in digital modes. When contact's experienced positively and when it's managed well, it's associated with positive wellbeing outcomes for children and young people in both the short and the long term, across a whole variety of different domains. Equally, poorly managed contact is negatively experienced, and crucially, that can pose significant risks to children and young people's wellbeing. So support and adequate resourcing for that support is critical. The evidence that we've reviewed shows clearly that investing in contact, in the safe and meaningful involvement of key people, will pay dividends in terms of children's well-being in the short and the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you to Padmini as well for a really, really clear overview of those research findings. Right, I'm going to suggest we go straight on now to Beth's presentation, and she is going to outline the findings of some research undertaken earlier this year during lockdown. Beth.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. I'm just trying to put this, there we are, good. So I'm going to talk about this piece of research that we carried out during the early period of the lockdown that focused on virtual family time. And I worked on this project with two colleagues at the UEA, Ruth Copson and Penny Sorensen. Our questions were really, first of all, we wanted to find out what contact children were actually happening, because the government guidance was not hugely clear about what should be taking place. So we wanted to know, had all face-to-face contact stopped, or what was being put in its place? And we wanted to know how alternatives to direct contact were being experienced by everybody involved, the carers, the parents, the children, the professionals. So we had two main methods to find these things out. We carried out some interviews predominantly with professionals across a range of different settings, but some interviews with parents, carers, and an adoptive parent. And then we had an online survey, and that's where we heard really predominantly from people with first-hand experience. So foster carers, kinship carers, adoptive parents, birth parents, and other relatives. We didn't attempt to engage young people in sharing their views. So everything I'm saying about how the young people were reacting is through the eyes of their parents, their carers, their social workers. But we did have one young person who filled in the survey nevertheless. So in terms of what was happening, the headline picture really way back in March, April, May was that almost entirely face-to-face contact had stopped until further notice. And people had quite rapidly started to use video calls as an alternative. Now, just video calls encompass a wide range of variation. So some video calls were mediated, contact centres took on the work of setting up the calls. They would be there during the call, maybe with their camera on, maybe with their camera off. But it was very much a mediated experience. For a lot of families, it was the child's carers who were mediating the contact, who were setting up and arranging it with the birth parents, and who were there during the call. Some children were just speaking to their parents by themselves, so huge variation there. And quite quickly, people talked about the importance of trying to make these video calls interactive, trying to make them play-based or activity-based, because people's early experiences of just, plonking young children in front of a screen and expecting them to engage with their parents, people realized that that was not working very well. So there was variations in there in what was actually happening during the call. Some people replicated the in-person arrangements in terms of frequency and duration, but other people really changed it around. And a lot of people went for a more of a little and often way of keeping the child connecting to their family, as opposed to a more formal kind of once a fortnight for an hour or so. It might be several times a week for a few minutes. Now, we saw the widespread use of the video calls in kinship care, residential care, and foster care, but only really used in adoption for a few children who were otherwise having direct contact with siblings. But even then, a lot of adoptive parents and adoption professionals said, because that face-to-face contact in adoption is A, rare, and B, if it does happen, it tends to be very infrequent, a lot of people were just saying, well, we'll just wait until the situation is different, the pandemic calms down. So they were postponing it. Phone calls and messaging were being used, particularly by teenagers with their own phone. And sometimes this was not a change. People were doing that anyway before the pandemic, and they carried on doing it. Where it was new was where the switch had been made from face-to-face to video calls, and people were finding that the video calls couldn't last very long because of children's attention span. So in a lot of cases, carers were trying to fill the gap for parents who were maybe used to having a few hours with their child, and now it was down to kind of a few minutes here and there. They were trying to fill the gap by keeping parents updated with what was happening with maybe text messages, phone calls, or even sending short video clips to the parents. Now, some carers were quite happy to do this with their own phone, and they weren't concerned about sharing their numbers. But for some carers, that was an issue about using their phone for messaging and video calling. They didn't want to give out their own phone number. Now, there were some exceptions where face-to-face family time was continuing. They were very rare, but the kind of situations that people talked about where they were facilitating this were, for example, situations where teenagers were so keen to see their family that the feeling was they're going to vote with their feet, they're going to do it anyway, so we might as well try and support them to do it safely. Other situations where where professionals felt that children had a very compelling need. For example, young children who had recently entered care and were missing their parents really a lot, and that was, not helping them to settle in their foster home, might be an example of where a social worker might arrange for the carer to meet the parents in the park. Some people were trying to really make these face-to-face meetings COVID safe by advising people around social distancing and hand washing and things like that. Now, what do people tell us about children's experiences of contact? Well, it was very varied. Overall, people felt that it was a reasonable alternative under the circumstances, and that children valued the chance to at least see their parents' faces, hear their voices, and have some kind of interaction that was more meaningful than a phone call or a letter. But exactly how children reacted to it depended on a whole range of situations, which, you know, Janet has really emphasized well in her talk, that there's a whole context around contact. So it's age, individual needs and preferences, previous experiences of contact, the nature of their relationships with their birth family members. But some of the variations that people talked about. The difficulties of virtual contact for babies was highlighted by pretty much everybody we spoke to who had experience of that, you know, it's not very meaningful for babies to see their parents on a screen. It could even be quite confusing, with babies not understanding why they can see this person, but they can't touch them. Even for older children, toddlers, and even primary school age children, people talked about children's attention span, that just talking to parents on a screen did not hold their attention for very, very long. But certainly people emphasized that the younger children were, the harder it was to make virtual contact work, and the older they were, the easier it was. So for teenagers, some people highlighted that the switch to video calling was really welcomed by some teenagers, that they preferred it to maybe meeting with their parents in a family centre setting, which they might feel was a bit formal and a bit stiff. And in contrast, they felt that chatting on a video call felt more normal and natural to them. So, you know, some people did talk about, you know, when we can go back to normal, which I know we're not back to normal yet, but we're not necessarily going to stop doing these video calls, because it works well in some situations for some children. But people did talk about the limitations of direct contact for children, that some children were really missing actually that tactile experience of being able to hug their parents, see them, smell them. You know, that it was a bit of a second-class experience for some children. With regard to children for disabilities, again, we saw it could be very individual. Some people talked about really surprising benefits of the video calling for disabled children, but other people said, you know, they can't make any sense of it. It's not working. They really, really need to see their parents. Now, the nature of children's relationship with their families was really important, and I think the virtual contact kind of threw a light on the quality of the in-person contact for some children. So some children were said to dislike the video calling because it brought the parent into their home in a way that kind of controlled contact in a contact center setting didn't. That could feel safe to the child, but seeing their mum and dad in their foster home, it was invading their safe space. But for other children, it seemed to throw a light on the fact that maybe they didn't feel safe being in the same physical space as their parents, but they felt much safer doing it via a video call. It taken the emotion out of it for children. Now, one kind of benefit or challenge of contact, depending which way you look at it, was that these video calls were kind of integrating the child's two worlds a little bit more, particularly where carers were facilitating the contact. You know, the parents could see around the foster home, the child could give them a virtual tour, the foster carers could see around their birth parents' home and see what their situation was like. So that was seen to be a benefit for some children. It's bringing their two worlds together. People also talked about the benefits to children of not having to travel, not having their routines so disrupted, less time spent on the contact. So that was seen as a benefit in some cases. And a really important message that I've mentioned already is people talked about the importance and the work involved in making these calls engaging, and that being creative, planning games, planning what you're going to do and say, having props and toys could be really the way to make these calls successful. So what did carers feel about the contact? Well, they talked about the increased demands and responsibilities that were fell upon them to set up, organise, support children with keeping engaged on calls, support parents to engage their children. It did put a lot more on parents and carers, but many were adapting, some were struggling at times. And on the whole, carers were really focused on just trying to do what was the best for children. Some people did feel that they'd been dumped with a lot of stuff and left to get on with it by professionals. Kinship carers in particular, where, you know, where the child was no longer in care, felt they were just kind of left to work this all out by themselves. Adoptive parents as well, because also children are no longer in care. People talked about this new possibility to have a relationship with parents. Some people valued that, the fact that they could have this window into the parents' world. But they also talked about the stresses and strains of managing confidentiality, managing risks, particularly when they were the person left with supervising it all. Some people liked having more control in this way. Some people were frustrated that professionals wouldn't let them just sort the contact out and sort it out themselves. So it comes back to this individualized approach that Janet had talked about. Carers talked about, you know, all the work of managing children's reactions, but also having to manage birth parents' reactions. And that they were often doing this alongside increased stress during the pandemic, having children at home from school all day, managing worries about the virus, managing, you know, issues with their own work. So, you know, it's all happening in a very busy and different context. Parents talked about the really increased anxiety and distress that they were feeling during the contact, worrying, are their children okay? And most parents, however, despite this increased worry, did accept that changes were necessary. They could see that everybody was in the same boat and that it was about keeping people safe. But some parents were angry and frustrated about not being able to see their children. Parents talked about missing, again, the tactile experience, not being able to hug their children and how difficult that was. And some parents highlighted just the difficulties of participating in contact in this way when they had very little credit left on their phone, where they couldn't go to the library and use a computer, where they didn't have the equipment, where they didn't know how to engage with platforms like Skype or Zoom. Probably the biggest worry for parents that was highlighted by everybody, not just parents themselves, but professionals, was what is the impact going to be on parents where the children were in temporary care, where there was a parenting assessment underway, particularly for babies, where there was no opportunities for bonding and attachment building. That was a major worry raised in relation to the impact on parents. Some parents liked the chance to connect with foster carers and learn more about their child's life in the foster home. Other people found it inhibiting and they wanted a private time with their child. And parents did find it kind of dispiriting that their children, you know, found it hard to engage in video calls. So the recommendations that arose out of our report, really, first of all, that there was an urgent need to consider this issue about face-to-face contact and babies, where there's a situation where the plan is not yet clear. And I think it's definitely something that absolutely has to be taken into account when we're thinking about these 26 weeks. If a parent has not been able to see their child, they cannot build an attachment, they cannot fully demonstrate their parenting capacity, that has to be taken into account. In terms of thinking about the contact and managing the contact, all those key principles that Janet has talked about apply exactly the same way to contact during lockdown. You know, we have to think about the quality, we have to support people, we have to have an individual approach, we have to be clear about what we're doing it and why. So, you know, they still apply. As I mentioned earlier, the report did highlight the value of digitally mediated contact beyond the pandemic. And I think there's a lot of learning there about not just immediately going back to exactly what we were doing before. And people also talked about the potential for digital contact in relation to adoption, where letterbox is often seen as quite limited and problematic. Just some personal reflections for me, having almost exclusively researched post-adoption contact. This study, which cut across different placement types, really threw a light on how the placement setting drives the contact plan. And that makes me query whether are we always fully focused on children's needs. So there was stark differences in relation to contact in lockdown for the adopted children. So parents whose children were adopted, you know, often had no information about how their children were, and, you know, they couldn't see them on a video call. Parents might have children in kinship care, they might have another child in foster care, they might have another child who was adopted, but those adopted children, you know, there is not that face-to-face contact. So I think that's an issue for us to think about. Why do we treat children so differently in these different settings? Should it not be led by their needs? It threw a light on the different control and support that carers have depending on the placement setting, and particularly the lack of support for kinship carers. And it threw a light on the role of foster carers in relation to contact, because a lot of foster carers said, we weren't much involved in this before, and now we are. And we do have to think about how can we integrate children's worlds together. So I think that is the end of that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Beth. Some really useful insights, not just in terms of practice during social distance times, but as you say, for us to think about practice as we come out of the pandemic. Right, we've got about 20 minutes for questions, and please feel free to start putting your questions in the chat. We've had a couple of questions come in already. And in fact, a comment from Sarah Parsons that I wanted to start with, which was just a reflection on having heard the presentation and comments that were made about the need for the complexity of decision making around what's in the best interest of children, and how that sits with such a formulaic approach that's often seen in terms of contact decisions. I wondered, Janet, if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, I'm happy to. I mean, I think it's probably the single most important point that comes out of the two evidence reviews, and I think it's, you know, it's really striking in that light to think about the scope of that. I mean, Padmini highlighted the number of, you know, the number of different research projects that we looked at in depth, and you know, there are a really diverse bunch of projects, and you know, across UK nations and internationally. We had an international scope for the review, and I think that's, you know, it relates to the point that Beth's making, which about how much decisions about contact get determined by placement type rather than by a child needs-led approach. And it's, I mean, you know, within, if you're thinking about meanings and constructions of family, family doesn't get much more complicated than family is for this group of children, young people. And I think one of the other things that comes out of the review is how that just continues to be complicated. So, you know, I know in my own research in the past, a child might move out of a foster placement into another setting, and some of the people from that former foster placement continue to feel like family, continue to be really important for them, even though others might not be. And I think formulas seem very convenient when we're making decisions under pressure, but children's lives and these children's lives are just complicated. And I think the fact that that comes through so clearly across such a diversity of research, across different placement and permanency arrangements, tying to what Beth was saying, I just think we have to accept that and move towards and move away from formulas to an individually tailored dynamic approach.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. It's been really fascinating. I would absolutely endorse that from a CAFCAS policy and practice perspective. We work towards the individual needs of each child, and that's the basis of our assessment. But as you know, across the various parts of the spectrum of interested parties, there is a lot of people would want to work towards a more of a formulaic approach and want to shortcut those the assessments. So I'm just really interested to see that your research will help us in our work. For instance, we've now got the parental involvement review starting with government that will really touch on this space, and this is going to be, it's very timely in that sense.
Could I ask you a question, Sarah, about how much you feel research evidence is used in these discussions in court proceedings? And how confident people feel using and drawing on research evidence to make their points.
Arthur, we've got a lot of CAFCAS colleagues on the call, but my perspective on this is that we do use research, but that are always cautious not to draw on individual research, because there's always the danger of somebody in cross-examination contradicting that. But because this is a cross-cutting study, it's a review of multiple sources of evidence and research. It will be it's hopefully seen as reliable, and I really would like to work with you closely going forward from today on how we integrate this into our practice in CAFCAS and work across the sector to make sure judges understand it and magistrates too.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Laura in next, Laura Scale, just to talk about the comment you put in the chat.
Hi, yeah, I just think it's really helpful just to think about how contact can re-traumatize children, because there's often an expectation when when cases come into the court arena that contact must take place. And I think that it's good to think about different ways of the contact taking place, you know, looking at kind of virtual options, which haven't really been available to us before the pandemic. So I think that that's kind of another opportunity that we can, you know, is really useful for children. So it doesn't always have to be kind of how supervised contact has traditionally been. I think that we can think a little bit more widely and think about the child on much more of an individual basis. I think that's what we need to be encouraging.
Thank you. And Caroline Crosswood, you wanted to come in.
Hi, yes. Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting about it. Kind of makes us think a bit more dynamically about contact, and certainly when we're sort of coming to final hearings as guardians, that we need to be asking those questions about who's important in their lives, who's going to support that contact, what about foster care. I thought it was really interesting, you know, that some foster carers were much more sort of like, oh, I prefer to just get on with it and arrange it, and they're quite happy to kind of facilitate and support video or telephone as well, and the need really for the IRO to kind of strengthen their role throughout the child's life, because as pointed out on the COVID restrictions, older children often found it quite easy to use the kind of video calls and messaging and that kind of thing, because that's actually how they just communicate. So I think it really kind of brought home for me the need to question and think much more openly and dynamically about contact arrangements.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, Beth, that was a real insight from the lockdown research, was the extent to which some foster carers at least felt they could take on more responsibility in terms of managing contact. And that hadn't been seen in the context of the pandemic. Perhaps that gave us an opportunity to see that more clearly.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's a long time since I've worked in local authority social work practice, but I'm not sure to what extent it's kind of what is the level of overlap between foster families and birth families. I mean, when I was a social worker, there used to be quite a lot, you know, taking parents to visit the foster home when a child first moved in, and maybe foster carers facilitating contact in the foster home. It seemed to be a lot of people were saying, well, we were not having much to do with this at all. The children will be taken by their social worker, or they might take them and they'd just say hi to the parent at the end, and that's it. So I think, you know, that idea of integrating the child's world is important for us to think about.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Mina next, who submitted a question in advance, which I can read out, but I think Mina Sells is there.
I'm quite happy for you to read it out, Lisa.
Shall I read it out? Okay, well, there were several questions actually.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I must say that it was more focused on private law than the public law cases. So
yeah. Well, I'll put the questions anyway to the panel and see if we can draw on the evidence that we do have. I mean, you were asking questions about the impact on the child in certain situations, for example, where a child may not remember their parents due to you know, lack of memory recall, or a situation where they're encountering parental gender transition situations. So some quite specific circumstances, but I wondered, just to put it back to the researchers, whether we could draw on any evidence here to help inform practice. I'm going to go to Janet first.
Yes, I mean, I think they're really important questions, and I think they're also good examples of where principles do span public and private law in quite useful ways. And in terms of contact when parents have been absent long term, or children might not have memories of them, I think there's actually useful learning that can come from studies. I mean, I'm thinking about post-adoption contact, for example, when and Beth's work is really the leading work in that area, where you might be thinking about life story work. You might be thinking about how, you know, how in a child-centered way you can think about building the child's understanding, and then really supporting a child to make decisions, or to understand their views, their feelings around kind of raising levels of contact there. And so I think actually those initial principles that we talked about starting from a child-centered approach, it's not about the parent's right to the child necessarily, but it's about, you know, from a child-centered perspective, thinking about that as being an important connection, and then how do you support the child to make sense of that and to move forward. And then in terms of transgender parenting, I think we were actually talking about this just before the seminar started, and there is some really interesting research going on, not in relation to public or private law, but just in relation to kind of 21st century families. So I know Susan Gollenbach at Cambridge University has got a research project ongoing with that. And it's probably a good moment to hand over to Beth, actually, because you mentioned that you have a colleague at UEA, Beth, who's working on that.
Yeah, my colleague Christine Cocker has been looking at transgender parenting. So I've just put a link in the chat to a systematic review of the research around transgender parenting. So there might be some insights in there around contact issues. I think with regard to the issue about children who don't remember their parent, whether that's private law, public law, adoption, foster care, I think we have to bear in mind that all the research suggests that for the child, the absent parent is in their mind. Whether they're in their life, they're in their mind. And that what they're thinking and feeling about their parent, what questions they have, is going to change as the child gets older. So we have to think about, yes, these connections that are enacted in relation to contact, but we also have to think about what else is going on for the child in terms of helping them talk and think about and make sense of their life story. And why is it that they're in foster care? Why is it that they live with their granny and not their mum? Why is it that they're adopted? So, I mean, how people talk about this in adoption is the distinction between kind of structural openness, which will be the contact, and communicative openness, which is the kind of whole atmosphere within the adoptive family and all the information available to the child and the opportunities to talk and think about these identity issues. So we need to think about that alongside whether the child is seeing their parents or not. How do we prepare and support foster carers and adoptive parents to have these conversations with children? How can professionals contribute to that identity formation process?
Thanks, Beth. With a few minutes remaining, there's a question from Laura about whether there's a plan to share these findings with the judiciary, and absolutely there is. I mean, I think we feel the role of the observatory is to share these findings with all professionals that come into contact with children during and pre-proceedings in public and private law. And we'll be looking for the best way to disseminate these findings far and wide. With that in mind, I perhaps ask one of my colleagues to put a link to our short 8-minute read that summarises the research messages that you've heard about today in the chat, because it's just gone in there. And we're really keen to hear from you, from CAFCAS staff and others, about the questions that arise for you in your practice, the things that you're grappling with, the insights that you would like us to explore from research, and whether you find the material we're sharing with you useful in your everyday practice. So please do get in touch with us through our website and let us know what you think. Then we'll also be in touch with you just to ask for your feedback about today's event and anything we can take from here. I think that just remains for me to thank very much our 3 speakers today, to Padmini, to Janet and to Beth, but most of all to thank you all for attending in a very busy week before the Christmas week. I much appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you at future events. Many thanks.